the U.S. alliance in the past 10 years, in particular, has undergone quite a transformation. But there was some skepticism some 10 years ago, but there's also a very different view of China as well. But I would say in the last few years in particular, the U.S., Australia, and Japan have converged, and that's sort of the theme of our report this year. In that we polled 1,000 respondents in each of those three countries and found that they actually have a lot more in common than ever before. And their views of the region, the challenges of the region, and the solutions for the region are actually converging and aligning more than ever. And the Australian and Japanese appreciation of the alliance have actually only basically increased over the past few years, despite U.S. political turmoil.
Speaking of which, the biggest stumbling block appears to be another potential Trump presidency. While the majority of Australians aren't particularly looking forward to that, it's not enough for us to want to ditch the alliance, is it?
No, and that's a huge takeaway this year. So last year we asked Australians, if Donald Trump is to win a second term of office, would you want to abandon the U.S. alliance? And 36% of Australians last year said they would. This year, that amount went down to 25. So just around a quarter of Australians would want to abandon the alliance. That 11-point drop, I think, is telling because Australians' perception of Donald Trump has not changed. They have an overwhelmingly negative perception of him. But I think Australians are increasingly of the view that the U.S. alliance is pretty distinct from the president or the occupant of the White House.
Now, as you mentioned before, the study includes respondents from the United States, Australia and Japan. So the China challenge was also addressed in this study. It looks like Australia is more likely to say the US approach to dealing with Beijing is too aggressive.
Yes, it is. I should note that Australians are twice as likely as Japanese respondents to say that the U.S. is too aggressive. But that's only 20% of Australians. The plurality of Australians actually support. Almost 40% of Australians think that the U.S. policy on China is appropriate. And around another 10 to 20% think that the U.S. is too passive on China or too weak. And so I think the fact that such a distinct amount of Australians are either supportive of the U.S. policy towards China, if not wanting more aggressiveness from China, I think is also a departure from where Australian perceptions of the United States were just a few years ago.
Defending Taiwan is another sticking point as well. Australians are less willing to support any military intervention if China was to ever launch an attack, but Japan and the US, meanwhile, they remain pretty steadfast.
That's right. But that was also a very interesting takeaway from this year. In the last 2 years in which we've asked that question about sending troops to support or defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion, we found that Australians were pretty far actually ahead of the United States and Japanese respondents in wanting to send troops. But once again, the U.S., Australian, and Japanese views are actually converging. So even though Australians' willingness to send troops or support of sending troops to defend Taiwan have decreased from last year, they actually are all within 5 to 10 percentage points of each other, the U.S., Australia, and Japan. And they all basically would prefer to not send troops on the whole, but if given a choice, they are more likely than not willing to send troops to defend Taiwan.
Now, the study addressed a number of different issues: taxes, artificial intelligence, the role of democracy itself. But this one particular point I found interesting. Over half of Australians want to outlaw disinformation, even if it impacts freedom of speech. That's compared to about 1/3 of US and Japanese respondents. That paints quite a picture, doesn't it?
It really does. I think the perception of government and the role of government in the United States versus Australia is something that I've noticed in my time at the U.S. Study Center. I'm American and I've been here since 2017. And I've noticed that the role of government in Australia and the support of a strong government here is a distinct difference from the United States. As much as we share the same language and so many of the same cultural traditions and the same democracies or same support for democracy, I think the view of government and the role of government in society is distinctly different. I think Australians on the whole are far more accepting and, if anything, expecting government to play a stronger role than the United States. I think it's important to note the United States was founded on a distrust of government, a violent struggle against distrust in government. And I think that's one key area of difference between the U.S. and Australia.
Now, Jared, finally, I just do want to ask you a question looking ahead now. So we should point out that this study was done before Kamala Harris was put into the race in place of Joe Biden. Now, next week, Kamala Harris will be facing Donald Trump in what's technically the second presidential debate for this campaign. I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball here. What can we expect from this debate?
That's a great question. If we can look at Donald Trump's past debates, you can see his first debate with Hillary Clinton and his first debate with Joe Biden, I think, were pretty telling. In his first debate with Hillary Clinton, he went out of his way to mock her, to insult her, and his supporters thought he won it. I should note that Hillary Clinton's supporters thought that she won it because she, to them, looked more presidential and more in command of the policy. And then in Donald Trump's first debate with Joe Biden, back in 2020, he went out of his way to interrupt Joe Biden, to be noisy and to be sort of difficult for Joe Biden to even express his positions. I think in this debate, we might see something, a bit of both. And we might see Donald Trump trying to basically instigate Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris, as we've all seen, has not done a live press conference since she's been declared the Democratic nominee for president. And we're going on over 40 days. And so I think this is a unique opportunity for Donald Trump to really try to get her off her game, get her off her standard talking points, and potentially slow down that momentum that she's been showing over the past few weeks.
It's going to be a fascinating moment in US politics, and it was also a fascinating read, that study as well. Jared Mondschein from the US Study Centre. Thank you.
Thank you.